Well, in the summer of 2017, two longtime commercial fishermen, John Aldridge and Anthony Sosinski, set out to fish from Long Island. Now, they were about 40 miles offshore. Anthony was sleeping below deck, and boy, was he a sound sleeper. And John started to get things ready for the catch for that day up on deck. He was pulling on a handle to tighten the fishing ropes. He was pulling with all of his might to make sure it was extremely tight, when suddenly the handle snapped off in his hand. And the force of that pull sent him spiraling backwards and off of the back of the boat and into the Atlantic Ocean. The boat was on autopilot, so it just kept cruising. As soon as John resurfaced from under the water, he began screaming for help, knowing very well there was no way anyone was going to hear his voice, especially not Anthony, who was asleep under deck. John watched the boat as it went up and over the crest of a big wave, and then it was gone from his sight. Like that, he couldn't see it anymore. He was alone. He was treading water in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. He was not wearing a life vest. And he was thinking to himself, this is the way I'm going to die. Now, can you imagine what that must have felt like? If there's ever been a hopeless situation, that has got to be it. Or is it? Well, John was trying to calm himself down, quiet his thoughts about dying, trying to stay afloat. He realized something. He realized that his boots were buoyant. He had an idea. He took off one of the boots, he emptied out the water, he turned it upside down, stuck it back into the water, and yes, it floated. And so he took the other boot off, did the same thing, and suddenly he stuck both boots, one under each arm, as flotation devices. And suddenly John had a flicker of hope. He thought about his family. The fact that no one anywhere even knew he was missing, except maybe the two sharks that were circling him about 15 feet away. But fortunately, they didn't seem to care. He tried to set goals for himself. Just make it till morning. Now, 4 hours later, back on the boat, Anthony woke up, realized John was gone. He called on the Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard began its search procedures, even though the Coast Guard commander admitted it was going to be extremely difficult to find anyone in so much open water. Well, back on the boat, Anthony, he found that broken handle and knew that John must have been doing a specific task at the moment that broke, and he knew that meant he was doing it at a certain depth of the ocean, and therefore he could pinpoint more accurately where the Coast Guard ought to search. And so he let the Coast Guard know. Well, John, he made it alive until morning, and he tried to keep his hope alive, that flicker of hope that he had earlier, but the hours kept passing and there was no sign of help. He almost had given up all hope when he spotted a fishing buoy and was able to reach it and climb onto it. And he suddenly had a new surge of hope. About 50 to 60 minutes later, a Coast Guard helicopter flew nearby, spotted John waving and splashing water, trying to get their attention, and they eventually were able to pull John up to safety. "We've been looking for you for 9 hours today," the Coast Guard diver told John, to which John answered, "Well, I've been looking for you for 12. Well, miraculously, John Aldridge survived. I mean, what an amazing story. What an amazing amount of hope. If it were most of us out there bobbing in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, we probably would have given up hope that there was ever a chance, even a sliver of a chance to survive. Well, hope is like that. Hope is that whisper that says to us, maybe, just maybe, these boots will float. So I'm going to turn them upside down. I ask you this morning, What is the hope of your life? For some, hope is that first candle that is lit when the power goes out in the middle of a powerful storm. Hope is that first day that you wake up and can breathe again after an awful cold. Hope is that percentage of possibility that you do have of beating cancer. It's that first ray of sunshine that comes through your window after a tearful and difficult night. Hope is hearing the words, "He's going to be okay." Hope is the flicker of maybe, just maybe. Hope is the fuel of our faith and of our dreams. Hope is what we celebrate on this, the first Sunday of Advent. Advent is actually a season of hope. The word Advent means coming, arrival. The season is marked by expectation, waiting, anticipation, longing. Advent is not just an extension of Christmas, you see. It's a season in and of itself. It links the past and the present and the future together. Advent offers us an opportunity to share in the ancient longing for the coming of the Messiah, to celebrate his birth, but also to be alert for his second coming. Advent looks back in celebration at the hope fulfilled in Jesus Christ's very first coming to this earth, while at the exact same time looking forward to hopeful and eager anticipation to the coming of Christ's kingdom when Christ comes a second time to redeem his people. During Advent, we wait for both the past and the future. It's an active, it's assured, it's a hopeful waiting. It's a season that's often marked by frenzied busyness. I mean, look at your calendar for the month of December. I mean, Advent is an opportunity to set aside time each day to prepare our hearts and to help us to place our focus on a far greater story than our own story. The story of God's redeeming love for our world. It's not a season of pretending. It's not a season of trying to do cover-ups. It's a season of digging deep into the reality of what it means that God sent his Son into the world to be Emmanuel, God with us. Advent is a season of expectation and preparation, an opportunity to align ourselves with God's presence in our lives. More than just a hectic season of buying, wrapping, and opening presents. Therefore, wherever you are in your own spiritual journey, I invite you into this season of Advent. It is a time that allows us to ask questions and to struggle as we take time to prepare our hearts for Christ's coming. Emmanuel, God with us. Advent is not a celebration that says that God has come to fix things. From broken computers to broken families to broken and hurting lives, Advent simply is a celebration of God's coming. God comes to be with us in the child of Christmas. He is God with us in the darkness, in the pain, in the chaos. He comes and he makes a way for us. That's the way that God has been working throughout history. I mean, you can go all the way back to the beginning. Most of you are very familiar with the beginning and the way in which God intended for creation to be, that we would be in a perfect relationship with God. Remember in the Garden of Eden, it says that God walked freely and openly through the garden with Adam and Eve every day. See, he was with us. He was with humanity, and humanity enjoyed wholeness and intimacy with God. But you know the story. I mean, human nature popped up, and Adam and Eve, they chose sin. They chose to do it other than God's way. And that sin separated. It divided God and humans in their relationship with one another. That relationship was no longer perfect. The brokenness of our world that we see today is the ongoing result. It's the outcome of all of our human nature. But do you realize that ever since, God has been working towards restoration and healing and wholeness for us and everything that he has made? And this is the overall story of the Bible. Throughout it, we can see God making a way and giving and reminding his people, all of us, of hope that he is still at work with us. He will never leave us alone. We see it in God's covenant with Abraham at the time that Abraham was known as Abram. In Genesis 12:3, God promised, all peoples on earth will be blessed through you, Abram. And when God encountered Jacob at Bethel, and remember we talked about the story of Jacob this past summer, he renewed that covenant and reinforced the hope that was rooted in God's faithfulness. He says, I will not leave you until I have done what I've promised you I would do. But much time passed, years and generations and centuries, and you know how human beings are. We are an impatient breed. How long, oh God? That was the cry of the ancient Israelites. From the time of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob to David to Elijah to Elisha to Isaiah to Jeremiah, the many other prophets, there was a repeating of history. There was a cycle to history that we still see today. A devotion to God followed by an ignoring of God. A devotion to God to neglecting God. There was prosperity and there was recession and there was feast and there was literal famine. And there was pleasure, and there was pain. The Hebrew people, you see, were not much different from all of us. Our human nature is the same. And when things get good, they tended to forget about God. And when things got bad, they cried out to God for help. Through it all, there was a deep and ongoing longing for God to fulfill his covenant and his promise of a Messiah who would come to make everything right, just like it used to be at the very beginning. Now, this wasn't just a happy idea that drifted in and out of the Israelites' consciousness and culture. This was a deep hope, their deepest hope, that sustained them and encouraged them and spurred them on, especially through thousands of years of uncertain waiting. And in the midst of this long journey of hope, Isaiah became the poster prophet for the season of Advent. Because through Isaiah, God gave Israel and God gave to us many prophecies and promises about the Messiah that God would send. And in that way, Isaiah was the voice of hope. Many passages from Isaiah are lyrics for Handel's Messiah. That grand, stirring oratorio written in 1741, it's lasted for centuries as part of our Christmas tradition. And why? Because of its beauty, because of its complexity, because of the truth of the words that it proclaims. It is a moving soundtrack of hope, no matter what musical style you might favor. Now Isaiah lived 700 years before Jesus, but he gave us beautiful words that ring with hope for the coming of the Messiah. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given. The government will be upon his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, and the zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. Can you imagine living in the ancient world and hearing Isaiah's words well before the time of digital or even written information? Just hearing a message like that, can you imagine the hope that would spring in people's hearts? Now, did Isaiah understand exactly what the full intent of the message and promises were? Well, on one level, I think he probably did, but on several levels, I'm sure he did not. Certainly, he did not know God's timeline for when it was all going to happen and when the Messiah would come. I mean, perhaps Isaiah thought it would be in his own lifetime. Or maybe he was wise enough to know that God's work usually works stretched out through generation after generation after generation. But Isaiah was filled with hope, and God's promises fueled him and his people to continue to hope for centuries. And as we turn our attention to the Christmas story found in the gospel, the narrative of Luke. Zechariah, he would have been well acquainted with the words and the prophecies of Isaiah. He was a priest. Luke describes him as righteous and blameless, a pretty good guy. He was a good Jewish follower of God and a spiritual leader for his people. And he undoubtedly held deep longings for the Messiah who had been promised. But Zechariah, he was in shock when suddenly, out of the blue, on an ordinary day when he was simply going about his ordinary priestly duties, God dropped a mega dose of hope into Zechariah's world, both for him and for the people of Israel. Now picture it. It has been 400 years since Israel last had a clear prophetic voice or a message from God. For 400 years, God had remained pretty much quiet. 400 years. Now, think about that. How long is that? The United States, it's only 242 years old. To give a comparison, about 400 years ago, Johannes Kepler, the famous scientist, was discovering his planetary laws. North America was still to be explored by Europeans. Jamestown had just been settled, and Henry Hudson had just discovered Hudson Bay. Now that's a long, long time ago, with many lives that have come and gone in between since that time. But it is still close enough in time that these happenings are recognizable to us, especially if you stayed awake in history class, right? So when the angel showed up and told Zechariah that he would have a son who, and I quote, will go on before the Lord in the spirit and the power of Elijah to turn the hearts of parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord, unquote, Zechariah knew the significance. He knew the prophecies of the Messiah, and he also knew that this was a miraculous occurrence all the way around. Yes, miraculous. Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth were old. We all know old, right? We all know that. They were too old to have kids. And this was a big deal for them. I mean, in those times, it was shameful, especially to the woman, not to be able to have kids. Zechariah and Elizabeth would have wanted children. They would have tried to have children. They would have hoped. They would have been praying over and over and over and over and over again to God to bless them with children. It never happened. It never happened for the couple. Even though they were well thought of, I mean, especially Zechariah as a good priest, the fact that they were childless still would have had a great stigma on them. It would have placed an asterisk in the minds of people when they thought of Zechariah and Elizabeth. Oh, you know Zechariah and Elizabeth, good people, but they have never had any children. Think about it. When Zechariah received the special angelic delivery, he was a little bit in shock, to say the least, and he couldn't quite get over the part about the two of them having a child. I mean, who, me? God, remember, we're old. That's not possible. As a result, God made sure that Zechariah remained literally speechless until his son John was born. This was certainly an inconvenience, not being able to communicate, but can you imagine the hope that sprang up within this couple and the people around them when they heard the news? The old prophecies are about to be fulfilled. The one prophesied to come in the spirit of Elisha to prepare the way for the Messiah is coming. God is moving to restore hope that he is still here, that the human expression of God with us is still coming, that God is about to stir things up and change eternity forever. Hope in Israel was alive again. Hope on earth at its deepest level was alive again. Now maybe some of you are saying, Jim, oh, that's a great story. But really, what does that have to do with me? I mean, that was 1,000 years ago. What about me? They weren't fighting cancer. Their spouse wasn't killed fighting in a war on the other side of the world. Their spouse didn't walk out on them. They didn't lose their job with no warning. They aren't so poor that they don't have enough money to pay the bills or the debts that are stacking up. Their kids and grandchildren, weren't expecting Christmas presents, not to mention a big feast on the table. See, no matter what kinds of problems and struggles you're facing right now, no matter what kind of season of darkness and pain you're in, let me encourage you not to abandon hope. Hope is still alive, even in our deepest pain and our most hopeless circumstances. Just ask John Aldridge. Hope is alive. Hope is alive because God is with us. How can we know? I mean, how can we find that tiny spark of hope when we're on the verge of giving up? Well, I think there are a couple ways that can kindle and reconnect our hope in God this Advent season, no matter what kind of circumstance you might be facing today. And the first is that hope is based on God's word. Part of God with us is his written word that he's left with us. These are his promises to his people, both long ago as well as today. The Bible is actually a piece of God. And those words are beacons of hope. They are reminders that can penetrate our hearts and spirits and assure us that no matter what we are facing, no matter how bleak our tomorrow looks, no matter how bad the pain gets, God will never, ever leave us, and never, ever will he forsake us. As Paul says in the book of Romans, nothing can separate us from God. Now later today, read those words from Psalm 139 that I read to you earlier. As you read those words from Psalm 139 again, ask yourself, can you feel the hope in these words? You are not alone. God with us means that he will always be with us. Nothing can take that away. The second way we can rekindle hope is to put our focus on God's character and on who he is and promises to be. Now, I don't know about you, but I've tried in my life over and over and over again to test God. Say, God, okay, I'll do this, but if you're not there with me, I give up. And every time I've realized that God was there. I've trusted God in my life. And you know what? God has not let me down, and so I feel that God, and a third point, is faithful. Very faithful. That is our God. That is his character. He was and still is God with us. Remember, God is faithful. Think about it. He fulfilled Israel's hope, doing exactly what he promised to do when the Messiah arrived that very first Christmas. He fulfilled humanity's hope for the victory over death when Jesus was resurrected that very first Easter morn. And one day, God ultimately will fulfill all hope and complete his work of restoration of all creation so it can be the way that God has always intended for it to be. This is the promise with which he left us, to give us a foundation of confidence and boldness and assurance. I told you at the beginning of the service this morning, I'm with you always, even to the very end of the age. And this is a promise worthy to fuel our hope. And because God is true to his character, because of who he is, we can take hope in him. As we nurture this living hope during this Advent season, and throughout the rest of the year, it can sustain us through our darkest days as we wait for God to move among us. Yes, God is always with us. Amen.